Shabbat Shalom, everyone. There's a weird phenomenon that happens to you when you become a rabbi. Everything you do or interact with soon becomes Torah. If you watch something on TV, if you read something, your brain soon filters this through the lens of how this applies to Torah. So what this really means is that my poor wife has to suffer me explaining how every show we watch together really has something to do with the Jews. And usually this is my imagination or my Torah brain at work, but occasionally, I'm right. Let me give you an example. My wife and I were rewatching this trilogy of films known as The Hobbit. They were released back in 2012. They're based off of a children's book of the same name, written by George R.R. Tolkien, 1937. And while we're watching these movies, my Torah brain is absolutely going berserk, because there are these group of characters in the movies known as the dwarves. And while I'm watching these characters on screen, they appeared to me to look like a very anti-Semitic caricature. Now, some people like to play the anti-Semitic card over every little thing, but I promise you, the dwarves in this movie look like caricatures of Jews. We only get to see the male dwarves in the movie, and they purposefully have these elongated features, such as big noses. They have these long black beards, and I kid you not, you should watch this movie, above the cheekbone, they have these long curls that are oftentimes braided. They look exactly like payas on a Hasidic Jew. Now, because it's been a while, I had kind of forgot the exact plot of The Hobbit. It begins by talking about how the dwarves used to live within the mountains, and they were expert miners. They loved to dig and mine for gold and precious jewels. They stocked their ancestral mountain with a huge pile of money, gold coins, gems, priceless treasure. The film goes on and on and on about how these very Jewish-looking characters are only driven by money. And then they do a wide shot across the front of the mountain, and you can see the entrance to the dwarves' mountain home. And the entrance of it looked exactly like the front of an Eastern European synagogue's Aron HaKodesh. That's right, their home looks like it would house a Torah scroll. It looked like the front of an ark almost. So the film continues, and we're told that the dwarves are kicked out of their ancestral homeland because of their lust for gold. Led and a fire-breathing dragon was led to roost on top of the treasure pile inside the mountain. The dragon forces them out of the mountain. So for hundreds of years, in this story called The Hobbit, the dwarves have to wander the earth looking for a new place to call home. Let's recount so far. Anti-Semitic looking characters who are obsessed with gold, kicked out of their homeland, whose entrance looks like an ark, and now they wander from place to place, working as merchants and smiths, waiting for a king from amongst their people to rise up, reclaim their land, and rebuild their home. Now, I know I have a Torah brain, but come on, there's no way this could be an accident. I was convinced, driving my wife crazy. So I did a simple Google search, and it turns out that I was right. Apparently in 1967, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and the very popular Lord of the Rings books, did an interview with the BBC, and he is quoted as saying the following, quote, The dwarves, of course, are quite obviously, wouldn't you say, that in many ways they remind you of the Jews? Their words are Semitic, obviously constructed to be Semitic. This is something I did not know. Tolkien actually invented several languages for the people living in his world. He created an entire Elvish language for the elves, and apparently for the dwarves, he created the Dwarven language, which he based on biblical Hebrew. Elsewhere, Tolkien wrote that the warlike nature of the dwarves is associated with his reading of certain books of the Bible. He notes their craftsmanship resembles that of medieval Jewish artisans of the Iberian Peninsula, while their interest in gold is associated with banking. For centuries, moneylending was one of the few opportunities and occupations that were open to the Jews. I found these ideas very interesting, but I still didn't like the way he described the dwarves. He used words like crafty and cunning and manipulative. In fact, much of the plot of The Hobbit revolves around the dwarves hiring others to do their work for them. The dragon that haunts their home, once they drive it out and into the sky, they convince a human warrior to shoot an arrow at the one weak spot in the dragon's scaly armor. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered about this week's Parshat. Were the Jews of Vayishlach crafty, cunning, and manipulative? Well, consider this. This is from this week's Parsha. Jacob's daughter, Dinah, is quickly noticed by Shechem. This is the son of Hamor, the Hivites. We're told that he takes her and he lays with her by force. But according to the text, Shechem loved Dinah and asked Hamor to arrange that he might marry her. Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled Dinah while Jacob's sons were out in the field, and although angry, Jacob held his peace until they returned. When he told his sons what happened, they became incensed. Eventually, Hamor went to Jacob and told him that Shechem longed for Dinah and asked for Jacob to give her to him for a wife, and to agree that their two people might intermarry and live and trade together. Shechem offered to give Jacob and his sons whatever they wanted as a bride price. Jacob's sons answered with guile, saying that they could not give their sister to one who was not circumcised, and said that they would only consent on the condition that every man of the town became circumcised, and then the two people might intermarry and live together. This notion pleased Hamor and Shechem, and the whole town circumcised themselves immediately out of delight with Dinah. This is all in our Torah portion. After 3 days, when the men of the city were in pain, Jacob's sons Simeon and Levi each took swords. They came upon the city with stealth, and they killed every single man. Then they took their sister out of the city and began looting the entire town. Now, I have to admit, this story is pretty crafty and pretty darn manipulative. Now, of course, the most important part of this story is Jacob's response to the whole event. He's ashamed of his sons. He berates them for their actions, noting that they have brought dishonor to their whole family. It's as if Jacob knows they are crafty, cunning, and manipulative, but he won't let them be cast as villains. The more I read about Tolkien and his dwarven Jews, the more fascinating the story became. It turns out that in the 1940s, The Hobbit was met with such success that it began to be translated into many different languages. And a print house in Germany wanted to translate the book into German, but this being in the height of World War II, they wanted to make sure that Tolkien himself was not Jewish. True story, Hitler didn't want Jewish writings spread throughout the fatherland. So the print house wrote J.R.R. Tolkien a letter asking him if he was Jewish, to which he responded, quote, "If I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people." In the end, Tolkien actively prevented the translation of his book into German while the Nazis were in power. And there wouldn't be a German copy of The Hobbit until 1957, 20 years after it was first published. It seems like Jacob and Tolkien acknowledged his Jewish ancestors were crafty, cunning, and manipulative, but he wouldn't let them be cast as villains either. I want to end tonight by noting that sometimes the distinction between heroes and villains is all about perception. Did Dinah's defilement justify so much death? Does this imaginary tale of dwarves justify seemingly anti-Semitic depictions? These are questions that we may not ever have the answers to, but I think they're important to think about because they lead us to have a Torah brain. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.